So I'm back on the topic of creating dungeon maps, and this time I'm creating a grid map of a dungeon, something that you could use as the basis for an encounter. And I've done so using the principle that I've covered in my previous dungeon videos, but I've also focused on the design so that it's a place that can combine the storytelling with combat in a way that you can use. So why don't we get into the right space of mind for this dungeon? Imagine descending into the depths of an unknown dungeon, where the air is thick with the scent of mildew, and the distant echoes of unknown dangers reverberate through stone walls. The light of your torch flickers, casting long shadows that dance across the walls, revealing carvings that hint at a long-forgotten past. Now, this is the atmosphere that you want to create when designing a dungeon grid map, a place that feels alive with history and danger and the promise of discovery. So in this episode, we're diving deep into the creation of an intricate dungeon complex. In this case, the Temple of the Black Earth. Dungeons have for a long time been the cornerstone of fantasy adventures. They serve as the most basic stage for memorable encounters and discoveries, and this episode will explore the essential elements of designing a dungeon, which will focus on trap mechanics, dungeon ambience, and complex layouts. We're also going to delve into how these elements can be used to reveal lore within combat and the map itself, as well as challenging players with puzzles and creating an immersive experience. And by the end of this tutorial, you'll have the tools to craft dungeons that not only challenge your players in combat, but also draw them deeper into the story and the roleplay. So, in this episode, we'll walk through the process of crafting a dungeon grid map from start to finish, not just focusing on the outline and the concepts and the theories, but also how to put them into practice, building the atmosphere, designing challenging traps and puzzles, populating your dungeon with enemies that enhance the story. So this Temple of the Black Earth is where a cult of Earth worshippers have hidden a portal leading to the last known location of the Jewel of the Moment, which is a part of the quest we've been following in this series so far. So I'm going to use this as a case study to how to tie quest elements into the maps itself so that you can reveal them step by step over a series of grid maps that I'll be designing. This is going to test your players' strategic thinking. It's going to test their problem-solving skills as they navigate the treachery of the unknown levels. So we're going to start, as we always do, with a blank A2 page. Now for this map, as I've done in the previous maps, I'm just using a blank page. I'm not using grid paper for a couple of reasons. The first one is, of course, that I'm going to be painting the bottom. So I'll be drawing in a pencil grid to begin with, and then I'll be using layers of watercolor and ink later on to show the details and the design aspects. And if you do what I do here, you can design a map that you can use in person or in a digital game, or you can just use the principles that I'm using in creating this map to flesh out your own digitally rendered ones. So let's get into it. The first step in creating a compelling dungeon is to decide on what mood or theme that you want to evoke. So, is the dungeon a forgotten temple dedicated to a themed elemental deity like this one? Is it filled with the remnants of ancient rituals? Is it more like a crumbling fortress, which is abandoned after a long forgotten war, now inhabited by the malevolent spirits of the restless dead? Because the theme that you choose is going to guide your design choices from the architecture and the layout to the types of traps and enemies that your players will encounter. So for the Temple of the Black Earth here, the theme revolves around an ancient cult that worships the elemental power of the earth. The dungeon is going to feel heavy and oppressive. It's going to have stone walls that seem to press in on the players. It's going to dive into the earth rather than building up. And the deeper you go, the less sophisticated the architecture is going to be. It becomes cruder and cruder, more earth-like and ancient until you get to the very bottom. But the cultists have left their mark on the temple. They've got carvings and statues that are dedicated to the power of the earth, and the very architecture will reflect the reverence for stone and earth. So I'm going to use a lot of dark, earthy tones in the map design. I'm going to use a lot of rough-hewn stones and earthen textures. Because ambience is a crucial part of making your dungeon feel alive. And you have a lot of options for creating that ambience both within the game and out of game. Lighting and sound and visual cues can all contribute to the mood that you're trying to create. And in a digital map, you can play with the lighting effects to create areas of shadow or bright light to reveal where the danger is and where you can trust your senses. And flickering torchlight and glowing candles, even soft ambient light from magical sources can all add to the atmosphere. And of course, we all know that sound is a significant part of the roleplay. And while you won't be able to incorporate sound directly into a map like this, it's important to remember that it will exist and make notes when you're designing the map about what kind of sounds you want. Dripping water, or the distant rumble of shifting earth, or the faint whisper of a breeze through the cracks in the stone. And they'll make the danger of the dungeon feel more immediate to your players. And you can add in visual cues to the map itself. Things that are visible from above and particularly large, like skeletons or crates or barrels or statues. But don't forget to make notes on the other ambient clues that you can see when you enter as a player, like ancient runes on the walls or broken weapons scattered across the floor. They can all tell a story without using words, and they not only add to the ambience, but they also provide clues to the dungeon's history and the danger that lies ahead. Because a well-designed dungeon isn't just a random collection of traps and rooms. The implications of the choices that you make as the designer tell a story. The layout, the placement of traps, the types of enemies, even the architecture all contribute to the narrative. And for the Temple of the Black Earth here, you can think about what the players can learn about the cult just by exploring the dungeon. When I have layered out this dungeon here, you'll notice that I have 5 layers. I'm using the 5-chamber method on a larger scale. The first floor, the opening hall, is an introduction to the cult, its history, and its beliefs. And the further down you go, the more you learn about them and their more recent history. So on the top floor, you'll find their altar room with statues of the deities that they worship, the ideas of offering metal and stone, as well as a library that's got ancient texts that detail the rituals and their ultimate goal, which can be used later on to decipher the puzzles and the traps that the players can encounter. And you can weave narrative elements like this throughout the dungeon. For example, the deeper they go, the more they might notice the walls become rough and unfinished, as if the cultists were digging their way closer and with greater urgency to the heart of the earth. And the gradual change in the environment can build the tension and make the players feel like they're coming closer to something more powerful and dangerous. So as you can see, I've finished designing what I consider to be the outline, and I haven't worried too much in the initial stages about figuring out what precisely the outline of the chambers is for this particular dungeon, because I've made more than enough now that I can kind of figure it out. And if you want some ideas as to how to lay dungeons out, you can check out the earlier dungeon videos that I've done. But in this case, because I'm starting with the strong idea that I'm going to have 5 levels and they're each going to follow one of the 5 chamber rules. So we're going to start with an introduction on the top floor. And then the second floor is going to be a puzzle. The third floor is going to be a trap. The fourth floor is going to be combat. And the fifth floor, the bottom, is going to be the final confrontation. And knowing that, I can add in layers as I design it, which I'm doing now, so that you can see from above what the purpose is. And I can imply when I'm designing it what I want that floor to look like and feel like. So I'm going to go through now and watercoloring the floor itself. I'm testing out a new method of watercoloring using the grids so that it looks like flagstones, and I think it's turning out all right. But as we go further and further down, the flagstones are going to be replaced with the excavation and then the original ancient temple, which is going to be just stone, basically. So I'm going to use different methods to show that, and then later on I'm going to draw the grid map over that. But let's get into the design itself. Let's move on to the practical side, the actual drawing of a dungeon. I've kept in mind the theme of the narrative elements that we've discussed as I'm going through, because a good dungeon should also have a mix of open spaces and corridors and hidden areas. It makes the map more interesting to explore, but also, and this one's the important bit, allows for different types of encounters and challenges. So for this temple, I've got the multi-level layout. Each level takes the players deeper underground. The first level is fairly straightforward. There are a few guards that'll teach you about the tactics that you'll encounter later on, even if they're not as difficult. And you've got a few simple traps and a couple of lore bites to set the tone. And this is going to continue as they descend. It will become more complex. It's going to have more twists and turns and dead ends and hidden rooms and trapped and locked doors. This is going to create a sense of progression as the difficulty increases, building anticipation in the players as they get closer to their goals. So when designing the layout, you've got to think about how the players are going to move through the space. Are there multiple paths that they can take, or is there only one way forward? Are there areas that require them to backtrack and solve a puzzle previously encountered to proceed? How are they going to feel as they continue forward? How are you going to make the dungeon feel like it's more than just a series of dice roll challenges? How can you make them question and role play their way through the world? Because traps and puzzles are an absolute staple of dungeon design. And when done well, they can really add a lot to the experience of going through the dungeon. But I know that it's difficult from experience when creating a dungeon as to deciding what those traps and puzzles will look like, how to build them into the world so it doesn't just feel like you've typed up puzzles for 5-year-olds and then slapped them onto your map. It's important that they feel like a natural part of the environment rather than just arbitrary obstacles. So for the temple here, think about how the traps might reflect the cult's reverence for the earth. There are pressure plates that trigger rock slides, pits filled with quicksand. They challenge players physically, but also make them think about the environment that they're in. And remember that any ambience within the rooms and any traps or puzzles that they encounter have an implication of what kind of effort it took to create those things and what the theme is. So what are the implications of the traps that you're putting through your dungeon or your crawl that tell you more about the world and the people who made it? Because tripwire traps and net traps are both different kinds of traps, yes, but what do they say about the person who set them up? How is a hidden blade trap different and more difficult to prepare than a simple natural rock slide trap? Because when you're filling your dungeon crawl with traps, particularly what traps you choose and what you fill it with and how you try to kill your players says a lot about the person who set those traps up, about the amount of time that they took, but also about the theme of the trap. Because pit traps, which swallow you into the earth, have a different kind of vibe to a net trap, which falls from the ceiling and imprisons you. Tripwires and hidden blades have different implications, different purposes. A tripwire is meant to alert people to your presence, but a hidden blade is meant to just kill you quickly and smoothly. And puzzles as well should also be integrated into the narrative. It's the same kind of concept as the trap, and really, puzzles are just traps that don't kill you, but delay you. And maybe there's a room where the players need to arrange stone tablets in the correct order to unlock the door, or clues are hidden in carvings on the wall. Perhaps they need to manipulate the flow of water to reveal a hidden passage. There's all kinds of ways to do it, but always think about the implication of what you're doing. What elements are you using? How much preparation does it take? Because one of the most effective ways to embed lore within a dungeon is through its structure and its decorations and carvings and murals and ancient texts all provide clues to the dungeon's history and the inhabitants' motives. And however crude or sophisticated they are, however quick or arduous or ceremonious they are in design and aspect, will influence how you've created the world and the implications therein. So I've got a few ideas here that you can take for your own traps and decorations so that you can fill your dungeon with things that are themed appropriately for your quest. In this case, because the cult of the Black Earth is very earth-dominated, it reveres stone, I'm going to use a lot of carvings and murals which show sacrifices to the earth deity in exchange for power. Carvings on the walls or wrought stone will tell the story of the temple's construction, and all of the traps are going to involve being swallowed or crushed by the earth. And because that's a very subtle way of showing the history, there are other methods of being more open and more overt about what's happening. Ancient texts, whether they're inscribed on the walls or found in dusty books, can provide a lot more detailed information, and perhaps even the players can find the journal written by a previous adventurer, which details their descent into the darkness following the cult's activity. And that adds to the explorative element, sure, but it also gives them much needed detail. If they're struggling to find the theme, be more overt about it. You can see that I've done a lot of the flagstones on the upper levels. They've descended into dirt as you've gone down, and then finally stone at the very bottom. But I've also added in a few details, like the carpet and the ritual circle on the top floor, the burrows on the third and fourth floor, the portal and the crack in the earth on the bottom floor. And now I'm going to go through. I've got a correction pen here. I'll put the detail in the description below, that I'm using to make a more easily seen grid map over the paint, so I don't have to worry about it being difficult to see. And I quite like the effect of it actually in the end. So while I'm doing that, let's delve into the inhabitants of this dungeon. And I want to once again give a shout out to Conflux Creatures. Thank you again for giving us the stat blocks. I have created this dungeon grid map with the intention of populating it with Conflux Creatures, Cultists of the Black Earth. And it all lends itself to the overall quest, but it's a great opportunity for me to explore who these cultists are and what they can do in a way that's going to be engaging within the environment. Because no dungeon is complete without its inhabitants. And of course, in this Temple of the Black Earth cultists play a central role. They're fanatical worshippers of the earth element, and their abilities reflect this. They're not just random enemies, they're integral to the dungeon's story, and as the players encounter them, they'll learn more about the cult's goals and their connection to the jewel of the moment. And at the bottom of the dungeon, they're attempting to open the portal that will lead them to the jewel, which creates stakes for the players. So once again, we want to thank Isaac and Conflux Creatures for his amazing stat blocks. He sent some suggestions for this particular dungeon. I'm going to be using the Black Earth Cultists here. There's a whole set of them that you can find through the link below. But the idea is the cultists use and venerate the element of earth. They're jealous and angry at people who mine it and take it and use it. And at the bottom of the dungeon, they're attempting to open a portal there, which is being operated by this hulking, twisted monstrosity of half rock, half human that you can encounter at the bottom of the dungeon. Take a look at all of the different stat blocks that he's using. They're all amazing. You can find them through the link below. So now that we've explored the theoretical and practical aspects of dungeon design, now that we've discussed the inhabitants of the dungeon and what the interior of it looks like, let's look at how it all comes together for this case study, which is the Temple of the Black Earth. So the players are searching for a portal that leads to the last known location of the Jewel of the Moment, which is an artifact which can grant a wish. And they tracked it to this ancient temple. Now the dungeon map that I've created reflects the stakes of the quest. Each encounter, each puzzle, each trap draws the player closer to the goals and deeper into the earth, which connects into the next stage, the next grid map, which we'll do next episode. And they're going to find clues that suggest that the portal is located at the very bottom of the temple and shows the history of the cult and the stakes therein. And I want to just sprinkle in a few references to our final boss for this arc, which I'll do in the last episode, the Ogremok. So the point of the dungeon crawl is the multi-phase of it, the introduction to their motives on the first level, and on the second level, using the living quarters of the cultists, they're going to encounter the puzzle of it, trying to get through the rituals and get past the acolytes without arousing attention or being drawn into traps. And then on the third level, they're going to encounter a multi-door system and a riddle that's inscribed on a statue. And once they've got past that, they get to the excavation. The cultists have found the portal beneath the temple, and they're making a beeline to open the portal for reasons of their own. So you're going to start with initial waves of cultists who try to stop the players. They're going to fight their way through. They might trigger some traps. They'll have to encounter some puzzles. And finally, just as they think they've succeeded, the final obstacle appears. It's the leader of this particular faction of the cult, empowered by the earth elements, who will stop at nothing to prevent the players from using the portal and attempting to use it themselves. And the players need to use everything they've learned, not just in the ambience of the temples and the themes that they've encountered, but also in their previous combats with the lower level cultists, to survive and escape through the portal to the jewel. Pacing is key to keeping a dungeon crawl engaging. Too many encounters or puzzles in a row will lead to your players becoming bored. It's known as player fatigue. And too few will make the dungeon feel empty and unchallenging. Getting the balance right is critical. You've got to alternate between combat, exploration, puzzle solving to keep the players on their toes. And one way to maintain engagement is to vary the kinds of challenges that the players will face. So after a tough combat encounter, give them a breather with a bit of a puzzle, a bit of exploration. And always, and this is just a personal tip, whenever you create a puzzle, give them multiple ways of solving it. If it's a riddle, then you can hide the answers on the walls or on previous levels. You can have books. You can make them think about the ambience of the dungeon itself. Use the environmental storytelling to keep them curious about what lies ahead, and reward their efforts with meaningful discoveries, whether it's a piece of lore or a useful item or simply a safe place to rest, which is not to be sniffed at in a dungeon. Because it's also important to build the tension as the players progress through the dungeon. Start with smaller, less dangerous encounters and gradually ramp up the difficulties as they get close to their goal. It creates a sense of momentum. So in this episode, we've explored the arts of dungeon grid map design. We focused on creating a challenging, atmospheric, narratively rich dungeon, and we've covered the importance of theme and mood, the role of lighting and sound, the use of traps and puzzles to challenge your players both physically and mentally while building the world within the map that you've created. And by carefully planning the layout, incorporating thematic traps and puzzles, populating the dungeon with enemies that reflect its lore, you can create an experience that your players will remember long after they've escaped their depths. Because while this episode is focused on a specific dungeon, the Temple of the Black Earth, the principles that we've discussed can be applied to a wide range of settings. Any ancient ruin or magical tower or abandoned castle offers its own opportunities for atmospheric design and unique traps and rich lore. And the key is to think about what makes each setting unique and how you can use that to create a dungeon that's both challenging and immersive. So, join us in the next episode as we shift our focus from dungeons, which you delve into, to castles, which you infiltrate. We'll be exploring the art of castle grid maps. I'm going to be using a different kind of grid map next time, but I'll talk more about that in the next episode with a special emphasis on defensive architecture and heist mechanics. So whether your players are storming a fortress or infiltrating a royal keep, this episode will give you the tools to create the maps that are as strategic as they are thrilling. If you particularly like this and you want more details, you want to talk to me directly, you want to ask for things, I have a Discord as well, and you can also join the Patreon, which is free to join, where you can get even more details. Until then, keep your dungeons deadly, your puzzles perplexing, and your players on the edge of their seats.